Good afternoon. I am coming to you from the site of Old Fort Jackson here on the Savannah River in Savannah, Georgia. Now, Old Fort Jackson was originally known in 1733 as Salter's Island, and in 1808 it will be renamed Fort Jackson in honor of Revolutionary patriot James Jackson. In the story of the American prisoner of war, the Revolutionary soldier is often overlooked or neglected. It is easy to understand in the grand scheme of things how the Revolutionary soldiers in prison could be relegated to the background of the larger story. Americans had not yet fully developed a national identity that was separate from Britain. And so to better understand these issues and concerns revolving around the American Revolution and prisoner of war, we must first consider the view that the British maintained. Now, much like the early stages of the American Civil War, the British during the Revolution did not have a policy in place on how they would deal with the issues concerning those captured. If they were to treat them as traditional prisoners of war, the British would have had to have given a de facto recognition of the American cause and the rebellion. Since the British did not recognize the legitimacy of the American cause, the pressing issue of how to deal with these rebels upon capture was not settled until the passing of the North Act of 1777. It is going to be under this act that the British, while not recognizing the rights of those in prison, did allow that the British were able to maintain their prisoners in prison while maintaining the ability to deny them rights as prisoners of war or as British subjects. As I said, to do so would have recognized the American cause, but to also have recognized their rights as British subjects would have meant they had to recognize the Bill of Rights as well. It also allowed them to imprison soldiers not only here in the colonies, but in British prisons, which those who found themselves in the British prisons often found that they had better provisions. Those imprisoned in the colonies, however, soon found that their conditions were deteriorating. And as the population grew, the British found it necessary to relocate those prisoners. Enter the notorious prison ships. And one of those ships may have actually been anchored somewhere along the Savannah River. Where we are not unfortunately sure of, but there was at least one, if not two ships here on the Savannah River. Now, the conditions on the prison ships were awful. They were kept in the hulls of ships, deprived of fresh air, proper nutrition, and soon the men fell sick with scurvy and dysentery and other diseases that were prevalent among the soldiers. One prisoner is recorded as having said, "It would have been better to have met a timelier death by the sword of a Hessian than be confined to a prison ship." And according to historian David Durzek, reports soon started filing into the American newspapers about the prisoners and the conditions, and the colonists were outraged. Now, the conditions on the prison ships went from bad to worse in the winter of 1778 to 1779. And it's because of the shortage of supplies. And so the prisoners were the last ones to actually receive any type of provisions. Well, in New York, the conditions are going to get so bad that the British are actually going to have to allow prisoners to be set free. Now, again, as in the Civil War, the prisoners leaving these ships were often so emaciated that they were hardly recognizable or able to move. And in some respects, you could say that this was a prediction of Andersonville to come. In 1781, the Continental Congress would convene hearings on the treatment of prisoners by the British. They heard varying testimonies from those who had experienced the British treatment. One such testimony comes from George Batterman, who recalled that the British, having taken this method of starving us for the want of water, to kill us or to make us enter into the service, they never allow a man that is sick to go to the hospital ship till they are so weak and low that they often expire before they get out of the ship. Now, it's going to be because of his testimony that Congress is going to authorize what is essentially retaliation by the Continental Army against British prisoners. Now, the British, of course, downplay their harsh treatment of prisoners, but the stories speak for themselves. One of those stories is that of Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen had been a prisoner from 1775 to 1778. He was transported back and forth from prison ship to prison ship until he finally landed in a prison in England. The British wanted to execute him. However, being that he was the Colonel Ethan Allen of Fort Ticonderoga fame, they were fearful. They were afraid that if they did, that the British would retaliate in such measures that would be in incomprehensible to the British. So instead, the British sailors were given orders to treat him as savagely as humanly possible. He was eventually paroled because his brother was able to secure his release in exchange for Colonel Archibald Campbell. Now, historian Edward G. Burroughs, in his work Forgotten Patriots, The Untold Story of American Prisoners During the Revolutionary War, talks about how the Continental Congress in 1785, as they were sitting in New York, just a half a mile from their location was Wallabout Bay. And in that Wallabout Bay laid the remains of the British prison ship Jersey, where thousands of Americans had died in its hull, their bodies wrapped in blankets and just thrown on the shore to decompose out in the open. He estimates that about 19,000 to 20,000 men died of starvation and dysentery in the decommissioned and stripped hulls of the British ships. Another historian, Catherine Prelinger, details John Thornton's mission in Britain as an American envoy to the prisons to assess their condition and compile an accurate list of the British held prisoners. And in this report to Benjamin Franklin, he details the rations that they're given, talks about how the clothing and the shoes that he brought with them to give to the men in the prisons were inadequate because still more than half the men were left without clothing. He talked about how those who were trying to escape, once they were recaptured, were thrown into dark, dank cells that were nothing but holes in the ground, essentially, that had no light or air. For those who could not stand to watch another man die in the prison, you could be recruited into the British Army if you wanted. And several men in New York did actually do this, but they used it as a means of escaping. So as we can see, whether on prison ships or on land prisons, the conditions that the men endured were horrific. I want to leave you with an excellent description of what the men on the prison ships endured. This description comes from a 4-canto poem written by Philip Freneau entitled The British Prison Ship. Freneau in his poem masterfully depicts in vivid imagery of sights, smells, and conditions of those detained aboard the ship in a way that is so poetically heartbreaking. Canto 4 specifically deals with the hospital prison ship, and the haunting words spoken are a vivid reminder that many of the men that ended up in such places did not return home. Soon as I came to this detested place, a wasted phantom stared me in the face. And art thou come, death heavy on his eye? And art thou come to these abodes, he cries? Why didst thou leave the scorpion's dark retreat, and hither come as sure a death to me? Why didst thou leave thy damp infected cell? If that was purgatory, this is hell. Thank you.